Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Myron Belkine. I'm an adjunct professor at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs, a former international bureau chief with the Associated Press, and the 107th president of the National Press Club. The National Press Club is the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming, with events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at press.org. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speakers and those of you attending today's event. Our head table includes guests of our speakers, as well as working journalists who are club members. If you hear applause in our audience, I note that members of the general public are attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. You can follow the action on Twitter using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speeches conclude, we'll have a question and answer period. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd like each of you to stand briefly as your name is announced. And from your right, Skip Kaltenhauser, an independent journalist who writes on politics and the law, and who coincidentally organized Ralph Nader's luncheon at the Press Club in 2004. Ray Mahmoud, a guest of Grover Norquist. Lucas Wysocki, video producer at Bankrate.com. Dr. Claire Nader, Ralph Nader's sister and a civic activist. Pat Host, Air Force reporter at Defense Daily, and a Speakers Committee member who helped organize today's event. Grover, I'm sorry, we've changed the routine because of two speakers. I will come back and introduce you and Mr. Nader in a moment. Donna Leinwan-Leger, a reporter for USA Today, vice chair of the Speakers Committee, and a past National Press Club president. Skipping over Mr. Nader for a moment, John Welsh, account supervisor at Edelman, and a Speakers Committee member who helped organize today's luncheon. Saman Norquist, wife of Grover Norquist. Andrea Bricquier, economics reporter at Investors Business Daily. Edward Mooney, a guest of Ralph Nader. And Jonathan Salant, a veteran political reporter and a former president of the National Press Club. To longtime Washington observers, Ralph Nader and Grover Norquist might not seem like natural allies, but throughout their careers, they have fought for a singular goal: good, responsive government. How they define responsive government and how they get there are where the consumer champion and the anti-tax advocate champion part ways. But today they say there can be a common cause. Nader, who founded Public Citizen in 1971, fights to protect consumers from a collusion of corporate and government interests. Norquist wants to protect Americans from overbearing government interests too quick to tax and too quick to spend. Long ago, Nader passed beyond simple concerns with seatbelts and hot dogs. He has built a national network of citizen groups that have had a major impact in tax reform, nuclear energy, and health and safety programs. In his latest book, Unstoppable, he warns that the United States is at a pivotal moment. Americans are more disillusioned with their political leaders than ever, and large majorities of citizens tell pollsters that big corporations have too much political power. Norquist established Americans for Tax Reform in 1985. The group works to limit the size and cost of government and opposes higher taxes at all levels of government. He is best known for his anti-tax pledge, to which he says 260 lawmakers in the 113th Congress swore to uphold. Norquist recently advocated for the federal government to stay out of the proposed Comcast-Time Warner merger beyond antitrust concerns, saying the marketplace is adjusting to consumer demand and the government should not meddle in a free market transaction. Today, we will hear our guests discuss where the left and right could come together to work for a better America. Please welcome Ralph Nader and Grover Norquist, and by mutual agreement, and I stress, by mutual agreement, it was agreed that Mr. Nader will go first and will speak for 12 minutes, and will be followed by Mr. Norquist for 12 minutes, and then we will have the traditional question and answer session. Mr. Nader, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Myron, distinguished guests and audience representing various views. I think the issue here comes down to an immobilized society. People want to get things done in this country, but the powers that be, as they have for thousands of years, have learned that the best strategy to block the will of the people is to divide and rule. As a result, we hear article after article about how polarized our society is: red state, blue state, Republican, Democrat, left, right. And there are many divisions and disagreements, to be sure. There are disagreements on reproductive rights, on gun control, on school prayer, on constitutionally required balanced budget, on taxes, on kinds of regulation, and those will probably remain. However, there are huge areas, and very fundamental ones, in terms of constitutional procedures, as well as substantive policies, where there is a large left-right convergence majority in this country. It starts with the public sentiment. As Abraham Lincoln said, with the public sentiment you can do anything, and without it you can't do much of anything at all. So we start with the reality that it's already out there in the minds of tens of millions of Americans who call themselves conservatives or liberals or libertarians or progressives. They agree on a whole host of issues. I first came across this agreement going functional, going operational, from mere converging opinion into actual political action when we developed a coalition in 1983 to fight the Clinch River breeder reactor, which had already piled up $1.3 billion, and they hadn't dug a shovel on the shores of the Clinch River in Tennessee. And our side wasn't getting very far, and the senator from Arkansas called up Bumper, and he says, why don't you call some of these right-wing groups? They're worried about this because it's a huge budget buster. The prediction is it's going to go to $8 billion. So we formed a taxpayers group against the Clinch River breeder reactor. We had some formidable foes. Ronald Reagan was for it. Senator Howard Baker was for it. General Electric and Westinghouse were for it. And it was quite an uphill fight. But in a stunning defeat of the Clinch River, we won in the Senate 56-40. That was in 1983. In 1986, against corporate lobbyists, there was a left-right convergence between Senator Grassley, a Republican of Iowa, and Howard Bervin, a Democrat congressman from California, to pass the False Claims Act. That would give government officials an opportunity, if they blow the whistle, government employees, to share in the recovery that would be pursued by the Justice Department. And that has saved tens of billions of dollars since then. And we see other examples. So this is not pie in the sky. We're not sugarcoating this convergence. We have examples. As of last year, for example, there was a left-right uproar on email, et cetera, to stop another war in Syria, getting U.S. involved in Syria. The left-right, in defiance of John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi in the House, almost got a bill through blocking the NSA from dragnet snooping. They lost by 12 votes on that. And at the state level, a lot of interesting things are going on. 15 state legislatures have passed juvenile justice reform, only possible because of left-right legislators. When the Kelo decision came down saying it was okay for New London to expropriate a whole neighborhood and destroy it and give it to Pfizer, 25 state legislatures passed a variety of laws very quickly, saying not in this state, you're going to take private property, condemn it, and give it to corporations, other kind of private property. So in doing this book, I go through the history of conservative philosophers, and lo and behold, a lot of them, from Adam Smith to Hayek to von Mises to Russell Kirk, were not exactly what the corporatists who've distorted their philosophy would have us believe. Many of them believed they were against socialism, they were against government planning, to be sure, but they were for a safety net, leading to Milton Friedman's minimum incomes plan and Nixon adopting it. That heritage goes all the way back to Henry Simmons, who was the founder of the Chicago School of Economics and was Milton Friedman's mentor, and it goes back to Frederick Hayek, who thought that there had to be a safety net. Public works was fostered by them. These conservative philosophers did not like monopolies, very eloquent in busting up monopolies. So we have a doctrinal basis here as well as current operational figures, some politicians, some writers, but most important, back there in the country where people live, work, and raise their children. The ideological schisms are not quite as apparent because these people back home are facing reality. So we have a great deal of disagreement between left, right, on reproductive rights and school prayer and gun control and balanced budget, as I said. But we also have very fundamental agreements. And it was illustrated in an interview in the book that I had of Ed Crane, the libertarian founder of the Cato Institute, when he said, Ralph, I'm against all corporate subsidies, unconstitutional laws, the liberty-restricted aspects of the Patriot Act, and the Federal Reserve run amok. I said, that's a pretty good start, Ed. That's a pretty good start. And so I want to focus on the two areas of agreement categorically. One is on procedure, civil liberties, protection of privacy. You do not engage in dragnet snooping, etc. So you don't engage in wars of aggression. You don't interfere with international law and constitutional law and federal law and go anywhere in the world building up empires and bases in 120 countries. You don't allow the Pentagon to automatically get huge budgets through Congress without following normal appropriation committee procedures, like the budget for the Iraq War, the budget for the Afghan War. That's a very important area, and that's where there's very, very solid basis here. As Grover will point out, there is a lot of collaboration between left, right, with the American Civil Liberties Union and right-leaning groups. In the substantive area, there are quite remarkable convergences. I sometimes think half of what the government does is shovel out subsidies, handouts, giveaways, privileges, economic privileges in the marketplace, and bailouts. And this is called crony capitalism by the right. It's called corporate welfare by us. And that is a huge slice of the federal budget. The Patriot Act comes up for confirmation or repeat next year. Maybe there'll be a struggle instead of just rubber stamping it, as it has been renewed twice by a rubber stamp. We have, on some esoteric issues perhaps, a collaboration. Left-right wants to audit the Pentagon, $800 billion unaudited every year. Not really the way a business would run it. And that's why you lose $9 billion here, $6 billion there. Pretty soon, as Senator Dirksen said, it adds up to real money. There's no accounting. There's also left-right on procurement. The government is the biggest buyer. Why not establish standards for efficiency and for national goals, like controlling pollution, advancing auto safety? And here in the audience is Gerald Carmen, the former head of the General Services Administration. And when we hit a stone wall on the airbag, even though George Will and others came out for mandatory airbag installation, in the mid-'80s, during the Reagan administration, I went down to see Gerald Carmen, who's a very conservative Republican from New Hampshire, and he was in auto parts in business, so he wasn't in awe of the auto industry. And I said, you know, if you have airbags in government cars, you know, they buy cars, 40, 50,000 a year for government employees. It will reduce accidents, injuries, and claims, and costs, and lost work. And that appealed to him, in addition to the life-saving aspect of it. And to make a long story short, against the opposition of all the auto companies except Ford, he put out a request to bid for 5,000 airbags in Tempo, Ford Tempos, the government wanted to buy. And that helped the momentum to get the airbag in all cars, and now it's on side airbags and front seat airbags. That's the use of the government buying power, and that's what is so important. That it's not just the more dramatic issues, it's also the issues of proper functioning of government. Of course, there's going to be a lot of disagreement on taxes, and the other converging area, I don't know whether Grover agrees with this, but there's a left-right coalition and 70–80% to restore the minimum wage, to take it up close to where it was in 1968, adjusted for inflation. There are 30 million workers who make less today than they made, workers made in 1968, adjusted for inflation. 30 million workers. And so whether you're conservative or liberal worker in Walmart, I don't think you're going to fall on your sword ideologically and say, no, we want to continue working at $8 an hour, while the boss is making $11,000 an hour every hour, 8 hours a day throughout the year. So in 2 hours on January 2, he makes more than the worker makes in the entire year, even before the martini lunch. So I want to conclude, by noting that this book does not sugarcoat the obstacles. And what we really need here to kickstart this big time, although there is now a left-right alliance on prison reform, which Grover was involved in with Newt Gingrich, called Right on Crime, joining with progressive groups. There's a lot going on that is not getting that much attention compared to the division, the divisive areas. But in this book, I argue that there are a lot of obstacles that have to be faced, but they are overcomable if we have a number of civic groups established whose only concern is convergence and left-right alliance advocacy. Because there's a lot of convergence. Cato and Heritage, Progressive Policy Institute, Public Citizen have all come out with reports against corporate welfare. But that's not their top priority. That's not where the grants and the contributions expect the work to be done. And so they go to work every day, and that's not their top priority. It's where the grants and the targeted issues often are in conflict with left-right. That's their priority. So we need this kind of singular focus. And I have a chapter called Dear Billionaire, and I'm looking for some very rich person to start funding a number of these nonprofit civic advocacy groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nader, for holding to our 12-minute request. And now I have the pleasure to turn over the floor to Grover Norquist.
Thank you, Myron. Last time Ralph and I were on a stage together, we were competing at Funniest Celebrities in D.C. So I'm going to be the straight man today. I want to make it very clear that when Ralph and I both talk about left-right coalitions, that's different than traditional bipartisanship here in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. Traditional bipartisanship is Republican politicians and Democratic politicians exercising their class interests as politicians and deciding to raise their pay, or to give themselves pensions, or invent new ways to kneecap potential challengers to their running for re-election. And they're very real class interests that elected officials have, and they can cheerfully be bipartisan in defense of those. Earmarks for decades. You get some, I get some. We all steal some money, and we all share it with our friends. What I'm talking about, and what Ralph and I have worked together on, are issues where right and left, people of principle, that are not willing to sacrifice. This isn't like moving to the center and giving the other guy something that nobody should have in return for trying to get something good. This is about issues where right and left both agree on what they want done. For instance, the issue of transparency. both right and left through the states, and this has moved across dozens and dozens of states, making state budgets completely transparent. And by that, I don't mean a printed budget after it's done. I mean every check as it goes out, every contract as it's written, every grant given online so everyone can see it now, not the people who can hire lobbyists or who happen to live in the state capitol or the federal capitol, but to make it available. It's all legally public. It just sits in shoeboxes in various basements or in filing cabinets, and it's not accessible to the average person. So what we're looking to do is those issues where right and left, both on principle, can move forward. Now, if total spending and all contracts were made transparent so every American, every person in the world could go look at them, I'm under the impression that people would look at it and say, let's spend less money. Ralph thinks that someone would look at it and say, Martha, look at how wisely they're spending our money. Let's send them more. We can have that argument as to how people would react to transparency, but each of us believes that a transparent government will be a better government. I believe it'll be a more limited government. Ralph thinks it may be more expansive, but transparency we can agree on, and often the people in power aren't particularly cheerful about that. So right-left coalitions are areas of principled agreement on perhaps procedure or even goals, not a compromise where somebody walks in and gives up a part of his soul in order to get something and moves, they think, slightly in the wrong direction in the hope of doing something else. I also want to point out that, as Ralph alluded to, this is not something that might happen. This is not an interesting theory. Ralph Nader's not written a book about what might, in theory, people could do this if you imagined them. I want to go through a list of things where this has already happened. And where it's happened in 7 states, it can happen in more. So we're looking now at the term limit movement. Actually, in my living memory, the least successful press conference I've ever participated in was one where Ralph Nader and I, in 1992, were holding a press conference on term limits, which a few weeks later, 14 states would pass with about an average of 75% of the vote, and not a single reporter showed up, because official Washington had zero interest in term limits, period. And it's revolutionized state government. It's revolutionized the committee system by having this sort of rotating French Revolution every 6 years where the leadership moves on. So term limits has gone across the country, both at the state level, in local government, and it shows up here, not only at the presidential level, but in terms of committee chairs. Right on crime, which I was working with a group of folks who said, do we really need, we thought it was 2,000, turns out it's 4,000 federal laws. Do we really need to keep 75-year-old former bank robbers in prison for the rest of their lives? It costs $50,000 to put somebody in prison for 1 year in California, 25 in Florida. Those are expensive, but it's also expensive in people's lives. You're disrupting communities, you're breaking up families, you're taking the breadwinner out, you're making it difficult for people to move forward. I'm tough on crime. I'm all in favor of executing murderers. I think some people should be in prison all their lives, but not the 2 million we got now. And we need to look at what mandatory minimums are doing. And this is where there's been a very good right-left coalition on working, and we've moved this through quite a number of states, often starting in Texas. One of the reasons why there's a problem with right-left coalitions on crime is that people on the left are afraid they'll be called weak on crime. People on the right are afraid they'll be called weak on crime by guys further to the right. And so getting people out front and making it clear that this is about, as Texas has done, continuing to reduce the crime rate more rapidly than other states by having fewer people in prison and perhaps more people under parole or probation, but also asking yourself how many people you actually want to have in prison. The issue of corporate welfare is one that we can agree on. I think we worked together on this many years ago when John Kasich was taking the lead and coming up with a series of suggestions that both groups on the right and the left could agree on. The government ought not to be stealing people's money and handing it to somebody else, period. And we made some progress on that. There's more to be done. The earmarks was real progress. Right on defense, similar efforts where people are saying, and the sequester is going to be a help. The sequester is going to require those people who can say, look, it's very important to have a strong national defense. It's a dangerous world out there. Got to keep the Canadians on their side of the border. You want to have a strong national defense. but you don't have to waste money. There's a new piece of legislation that I think is very intriguing, but by Congressman Calvert, Republican from California, that will, through attrition, reduce the number of civilian employees at the Pentagon by 100,000. The budget experts over there tell me you could cheerfully do 200,000 and still have a strong and robust national defense. There are going to be a series of efforts along these lines because the sequester puts a cap for 10 years on the Pentagon's budget. Those people who want more tanks had better figure out how to reform the procurement system. Those people who want more planes had better participate and help when we suggest that perhaps we need a compensation system that pays soldiers more and spends less time trying to figure out what they're going to do for them 50 years from now and front loads a lot of the resources that we make available to soldiers and sailors. So we can reduce the cost of national defense while making it more effective. The sequester is certainly an important project in making that continue. Civil liberties, right, left, share a lot of interest. The government, the party of government, friends of government, what they used to call loyalists during the Revolutionary War, the friends of government, always like the government to have more power because they're quite convinced the government would never abuse it. And I think it's important for Republicans to say to their left, to their conservative allies, do you really want Hillary Clinton to have this power you are now planning to give to George W. Bush? Because at some point he moves on. Well, we trusted him. Well, do you trust the next guy? And the people, when Clinton was accumulating powers like this, do you really want to hand this to the other team? We can make some progress in limiting the government snooping, the government's mega data collection, and making sure that our civil liberties are taken seriously. And that almost only happens in a left-right coalition because all the people who trust the government to always do the right thing don't see anything wrong with the government continually accumulating more and more power. One of the reasons why I think not only do we have this in about 6 or 7 fields, and it's moving through various states. Some of the stuff's actually happening at the federal government. I testified in what you would have thought was a difficult issue. This was reducing the disparity between how long you were sent to prison for crack cocaine versus white powder cocaine. It's a 100-to-1 ratio, and it was reduced to 18-to-1. And I went and testified, and there was this fascinating dance between the Republicans and the Democrats, and the Republicans said we'd be delighted to get rid of this bill that the Democrats had passed and introduced, and the Democrats would say, if you stop mentioning that this was our idea, we'd like to get rid of it too. And everybody was afraid that the other team would attack them for being in favor of crack cocaine if they reduced the disparity. 18-to-1, where that came from, I don't know. But 18 was less than 100, so we went with it. Some senator thought that up, and we said, we'll take it. And there you had a broad left-right coalition. And as I'm there, looking at a history of mandatory minimums, all the mandatory minimums for federal crimes, treason is 5 years mandatory minimum, okay? Things dealing with naked pictures of people are up like 35 years. So this was driven by how many people you could get to your press conference when you announced that you really, message I care, I really don't like carjacking. It's not like in the 57 states we didn't have laws against carjacking at the time, but some congressmen decided, we're going to have, I want a press conference, so we're going to have a federal law. Just have the press conference. But anyway, we had to have federal law, and carjacking became a federal crime with a mandatory minimum, even though the states were quite capable of handling that. So the mandatory minimums were really press conferences, not law being made, as you looked at what was considered important to have a mandatory minimum for. I want to suggest that the movement that Ralph Nader has written about and that many on the right and the left have begun to participate in is going to grow and strengthen. And one reason is that we've had some success, okay? When you see people walk out on the ice and they don't fall through, more people are willing to go out there. When politicians hear that Right on Crime has gotten a series of reductions in how long you have to keep how many people in prison and how much you have to spend doing it, and crime didn't increase, it fell, and things got better, and most importantly, nobody lost an election, that they're more willing to move this forward in their own state. The other reason it's going to move is that there's nothing else to do in this town. On the mega issues, we're going to raise taxes or cut taxes. We're going to spend more money or less money. That's settled. And as long as Obama's president and there's a Republican House, we're not raising taxes, but we're not eliminating any big government programs. We're not creating any more big government programs, but we're not cutting taxes either. So on the mega issues, where somebody wants to go west and somebody wants to go east, nothing moves. It's like two sumo wrestlers for the next 2 years that are absolutely equally matched. Nobody's getting knocked out of the ring. All of the energy, all the smart guys in D.C. and in state legislatures can look over at the successes that left-right coalitions have had on right on crime and right on defense and transparency and civil liberties. And I think you'll see a lot of the energy and opportunity and talent move into those zones, because for the next 2 years, the next 20 years, that's an area where we can make real progress for all Americans, and I look forward to working with Ralph and a lot of other people in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. As I said to Mr. Nader, thank you to you both for holding to the 12-minute limit that we imposed so that we could have more time for questions. Let's start with some questions for both of you. And some people say that the partisan divide is deeper today than it has ever been. Do the two of you agree? And if so, how do you think the gap can be narrowed? I know you might have touched on some of this in your remarks, but if we could have a succinct answer on that question. Do the two of you agree? And if so, how do you think the gap can be narrowed? So why don't we all?
Yeah, the partisan difference is much greater. When Nixon was president, he wanted the government to get a little bit bigger, and Ted Kennedy wanted to get a lot bigger, and they'd argue every day, and it gets somewhat bigger. And so year after year, the government got bigger, but always just somewhat bigger. So it's very easy to agree if you're all heading in the same direction, and it's just a question of speed. But we now have two parties. One wants larger government, one wants smaller government, and they actually mean it, each of them. What would a bipartisan compromise be? There's no way to do that, so they're fundamentally at odds. The solution is to elect a Republican House, Senate, President, pass the Ryan Plan. While we work to do that, Ralph and I will work on all the other issues.
Thank you. And I like, if you set a precedent, which I know Mr. Nader will follow, since we have a lot of questions, if you keep the answers brief and to the point.
Sure.
Thank you.
There is a partisan divide. Where? It's in the Congress. But back home, there's probably 90% of the people want to prosecute the Wall Street crooks and put them in jail. There's a real Main Street, Wall Street antipathy here. Too big to fail? All kinds of conservatives are coming out against allowing banks to be too big to fail. But it hasn't hit Congress yet in terms of any operational momentum. And that's what we have to talk about, filling that gap, pushing this public sentiment of convergence into operational mode.
Is the Supreme Court's decision, is the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision a good thing or a bad thing for the country? Do both of you regard money as free speech, just like the Supreme Court did?
I think we probably disagree on that one. I think people should be free to do anything they like other than punch somebody else or steal their stuff. And that includes spending their money as they want, buying ice cream cones or running ads or engaging in politics or making movies or films. So yeah, I think the Supreme Court decision went in the right direction, but we should have complete liberty. There are plenty of left-wing billionaires. This doesn't upset the apple cart. Just no stolen money in politics, no forced union dues, no taxpayer money. Voluntary, fine.
Yeah, disagree. I think a public election should be publicly funded. It can be done in a voluntary manner. I think McCain-Feingold is an example of a convergence, which has been eroded by 5-4 decisions of the Supreme Court. Money is very corrupting. The idea that money is speech, I think, would have horrified our founders. And furthermore, I draw the distinction between corporations and individuals. I think corporations are artificial entities. They should be subordinated constitutionally to the sovereignty of the people. The word corporation, company, doesn't even exist in the Constitution. And I think the Supreme Court's revolutionary 5-4 decisions, time and time again, are erecting a system in our political economy where corporations are supreme over individuals. And that is obviously, in my mind, a subversion of our democratic process.
For the next few questions, we'll have Mr. Nader answer first, just to keep a balance. Is it possible to have a government of, by, and for the people in this country without meaningful campaign finance reform?
It's very difficult, obviously, because it intimidates people who otherwise might move forward, either to run for office or just to be active when they see mountains of money on the other side and TV ads and radio ads and all kinds of apparatus. I think the important thing to remember, though, is even if there is no money in politics, there would still be a problem of mobilizing citizens. They've been so stomped on over the years. We don't teach civic education or civic experience in our schools. Youngsters are taught to believe, not to think, to obey, not to challenge. That's always going to remain a problem, and it has in many other countries as well. So it's not an elixir on money in politics, but certainly we have to start there, because it's just getting worse and worse, and it's impeding a variety of candidates from even trying to run.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to have campaign finance reform in order to have fair elections. In Wisconsin, they've taken a step towards that. Prior to Act 10 passing, a public school teacher paid $50,000 a year, found $1,000 taken by force without his or her permission and handed to the unions, and that was a condition of employment. They didn't vote to join the union. They never voted to join the union. They were in the union. They couldn't do anything about it. They took $1,000 and they spent it not as the teacher might want, but as the government wanted to. That law under Governor Walker was changed so that all dues were voluntary, and the unions could not take your money and spend it on whatever they wanted to. The most important thing in politics is no stolen money in politics, no taxpayer dollars taken from you and then spent on politics, and no union dues taken through coerced union dues. Voluntary union dues, all they want to spend, that's fine.
The last question addressed to both of you, and then I'll go into a session of asking you individually some questions. Could the two of you conceivably back a left-right candidacy, like a Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich ticket, which could focus on attacking the NSA, NAFTA-type trade deals, and the Federal Reserve? Mr. Nader?
Yeah, it's just what they stand for, how authentic it is, what their record is. I don't care what their labels are. Barney Frank and Ron Paul had a caucus in the House in 2010 to reduce the military budget. You couldn't have people further apart on that, but they're very sincere in that area. By the way, Grover, I've never discussed this with you, investor rights vis-a-vis management, but corporations spend money in political campaigns, and do the shareholders have a right to approve or disapprove? Would you agree that they should?
Yeah, well, it's easy for an investor to decide not to own General Motors stock or another. It's not easy for a teacher in Wisconsin to change jobs, since it's a government monopoly that they're working for. So I see a distinction there. What was the question? Oh, the green, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Kucinich, yes.
Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich.
Yeah, well, Ron Paul hasn't been to Burning Man yet, and Kucinich and I were out this year, so he gets to be top of the ticket. I think it's unlikely to have the left-right effort show up inside a presidential race, but certainly there are individual pairings on individual issues that are interesting, and it's sort of man bites dog, and the press is a little more interested when you can have a Republican and Democrat, and particularly a very conservative free market Republican, a very liberal Democrat together. That helps raise some of these very important issues, and it makes our job easier even when they're difficult topics.
Okay. Now some questions for Mr. Nader. And let me just say on behalf of everybody, I really appreciate the succinct, substantive questions that are relatively brief, and I don't want to add to the time. Let me ask now some questions for Mr. Nader. Having run as a member of the Green Party for so long and more recently as an independent, how would you rate our two-party system of government? And in your opinion, does it need to be overhauled so that other parties stand some sort of a fair chance? And if so, how?
First of all, I think there is a convergence on ballot access and instant runoff voting. You have Libertarian Party and Green Party often collaborating on lawsuits at the state level. They want to open up the system. I think most people in this country, regardless of how they vote, whether they're hereditary voters, Republican, Democrat, they do want to see more choice, more voice on the ballot. It'll bring out more people to vote, and it'll be more exciting and more meaningful campaign. That's one. The second is, I think that in many ways, the two parties are one corporate party with two heads wearing different makeup. We have a convergence on the other side. It's the convergence of corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans building the corporate state, or as Grover said, corporate statism. Franklin Delano Roosevelt called that fascism, by the way, in 1938, when he sent a message to Congress to start an investigation commission on concentrated corporate power. He said, when private economic power controls government, that's fascism. Both of those parties exclude competition. They harass people, Democrats worse than the Republicans. They harass people, getting petitions on the street. They try to wear them down. We were sued 24 times in 2004 in 12 weeks by the Democratic Party or their allies to get off one state ballot after another. Needless to say, it was pretty depleting for anybody who wants to have a campaign for more than 8 weeks after Labor Day. The last thing that's important to know is this combination of corporatism that it gets the parties dialing for the same commercial dollars is getting tighter and tighter. And you have the Clintons are now on the record. They are Wall Street, they are corporatists, and they're militarists. Hillary Clinton hasn't seen a war she doesn't like. She hasn't opposed a weapons system she doesn't like when she was on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And this is what we have to really face up to, because they'll all have different rhetoric on social services. There are differences, obviously, on real things like reproductive rights and school prayer. But on the fundamental issues of empire, on constitutional observance, on civil liberties, on Main Street versus Wall Street, on where the budget is going to go in terms of the necessities of the people or piling up into the oligarchy and the plutocracy, these two parties are converging very, very tightly. And we have to break them up and get more competition with other parties and other independent candidates and break them up in ways that is quickly and functional at the local level, where you can have more choice at the local government level. It starts bubbling up to the state and federal.
Mr. Nader, your 2000 race for president, it is widely acknowledged, threw the election to George W. Bush. Given how Mr. Bush's presidency turned out, do you regret running that year, and why or why not?
Last I heard, Bush got more votes from Gore than I did, but that's a minor thing. I don't think third parties are second-class citizens. If we all have equal rights to run for election, then we are all trying to get votes from one another, so we're either all spoilers of one another or none of us are spoilers. When you just say spoilers of third-party candidates, given all the great things they've done in American history to pioneer anti-slavery, women's right to vote, worker rights, farmer rights, when you just say that third-party candidates are spoilers, that's political bigotry. So blame the Electoral College because Gore got 500,000 more votes nationwide. It's the only country I know in the world where you can come in first and lose the election because of the Electoral College. And blame Florida, blame the thieves in Florida, blame the Supreme Court. You don't blame someone exercising constitutional rights to challenge the two parties on at least 15 issues that they are totally ignoring, will not discuss, but have majoritarian support. I've left my website open to document that. You can go to votenader.org, the 2008 campaign website. This is where there is a nice convergence, by the way, because it's a civil liberty issue. A very nice convergence. And right now, there is a left-right convergence moving to get rid of the Electoral College by interstate compacts. And so they now have reached 160 electoral votes. That is, Maryland, New York, California have passed laws saying we will throw our electoral votes behind whoever wins the popular vote in the United States running for president. And so it's only a matter of a couple of years before the Electoral College is history.
And one last direct question before we go and ask Mr. Norquist some. Considering, Mr. Nader, considering Grover Norquist's entire raison d'etre is to abolish all of the government regulations that you spent your life working to enact, why are you partnering with him on anything?
Because we can win on things we agree on. It's very simple. We disagree on A, B, C, D issues. We agree on W, X, Y, Z issues that affect millions of people. Why should we indulge in this kind of political vanity and be overwhelmed by what I call the yuck factor? This is what liberals have to get over, the yuck factor. And, the liberal intelligentsia, because they don't feel the need out there. They don't have the empathy. They're too busy writing articles and being in the top 1 or 2% of income in this country to get over it. They're not affected by this, but millions and millions of people can be alleviated in one area after another. By the way, the liberals are more rigid on all these issues, I have found, than people who are really conservatives, not corporatists and conservative garb. And you can see that again and again on this question of the 2000 campaign. Get over it. The Democratic Party could have blocked Bush on Iraq. They could have blocked Bush on the tax. They succumbed to Bush. They could have blocked them. Look what the Republicans are doing to Obama. Get over it. Stop scapegoating the Green Party. Stop trying to find an alibi for you're not standing up to the American people and their rights instead of dialing for the same commercial dollars that the Republicans do.
And now some questions for Mr. Norquist. First of all, before Ralph Nader came along, the free market did, it is acknowledged, a lousy job of protecting consumers from flawed automobiles and corporations ripping them off. Why do you think things will be different now if you realize your dream, as the questioner asked, of drowning government in a bathtub?
The actual quote is, you want the government to be small enough to where you could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. It's a question of how it's size. It's not a question of one's intent for dramatic effect. I think if you look at the history of big government, of statism, monopolies like AT&T didn't exist until the government gave them a government monopoly. Monopolies are created and enforced by the state. I think we probably worked on some of these issues together. The regulation of trucking, which kept prices high, the regulation of railroads, which was designed to keep trucking prices high, the regulation of buses to keep prices high, and airlines as well as rail, buses. All of these issues, the government came in and set prices on floors. Not ceilings. I'm not in favor of ceilings either, but they like to pretend they're coming in to keep prices lower, helping consumers. The cost of state interference in the economy is not to make things better, and if you look at the larger governments, they don't necessarily do a better job at these things. I think consumers working voluntarily without violence, without the threat of force, 300 million Americans deciding how they want to approach things. Consumers demand increased safety in products, and they can get it. If the government tells you how to be safe, moving away from something that doesn't work anymore moves as quickly as Congress. I want the economy to be able to, particularly when safety and health are at risk, to be able to move not as quickly as the FDA, but as quickly as Microsoft or the guys who make your iPhone. So there's a big difference between, you want the taxi guys fixing things for you or Uber? Choose.
For someone who hates government, why do you support only those candidates who want to use government to control women's health by outlawing abortion in all circumstances, as the Republican platform demands?
Okay. What's that last thing about hating government? Okay. Why do you hate government? Guys, this is the oddest thing. When people who want a limited government are called anti-government, okay? Cancer doctors are not anti-cell, okay? They like cells. Some cells are healthy and they just sit there. Some are very cheerful and they do good things. Some cells reproduce so quickly they hurt you and can kill you, okay? Government, where you have some modest and minimal rules, like keep your hands on your own stuff and don't punch other people, and otherwise you're free to live your life and believe what you want and do what you want, that is there's a big difference between disagreeing with big government and not liking any government, okay? We've had wars against people who were masters at big government. We didn't want government that big, whether it was the Soviet Union or the Germans. We wanted more limited government, like we have. And I think our government has gotten too big. We have 4,000 laws. You know, legally, the ignorance of the law is no excuse. I can't list very many of those 4,000, nor could I tell you what they are, and they could all put you in prison. I think we got too many laws, and I think we got too many regulations. I think the government's too big and it's too expensive and ought to be smaller. That doesn't have anything to do with hating government. You know, the government created by the Constitution is actually a thing of beauty and makes people more free. So I am not there with that. I work on tax issues, and I work with candidates who want to keep taxes and spending more limited, and that's what we work on.
Ask him the abortion question again. He didn't answer the abortion question.
Right. Just a brief follow-up. Why do you support only those candidates who want to use government to control women's health by allowing abortion in all circumstances?
Well, I don't. I mean, I've supported a lot of candidates who weren't there. I focus on taxes, spending sides of government. Candidates come with a big package of issues. I think the central issue of our day is the total size and scope of government, and reducing that as an overall cost and how people operate. That's what we work on.
But abortion can answer.
But it had the wrong premise that I always support abortion.
Okay, well, we asked the question, and he's answered it as he wishes, but yeah, I'm still being asked about, for a more specific response to...
There's a false premise in the question, and I walked through that.
Okay. Sir, tax reform went nowhere yet again in this Congress, yet politicians on both the left and the right say it is absolutely necessary. Mr. Norquist, don't you think that your no new taxes pledge inhibits lawmakers from devising a better, fairer tax system?
The question was, does the pledge, taxpayer protection pledge, no net tax increase, get in the way of tax reform? No. Matter of fact, if we remember back to '86 when we did tax reform, the only reason we could do the Tax Reform Act of '86 was that the pledge existed. It's why I created it, because there was a fear that if you told a bunch of congressmen and senators to go into a smoke-filled room and think something up, what they brought back, because they'd move all the little pieces back and forth, at the end of the day, it would be a Trojan horse for higher taxes. And however much they lowered the rates and broadened the base and they did all this stuff, what they would bring back would be a net tax increase. So Reagan said, I'll veto it if it's the next tax increase, and I got 100 members of the House and 20 senators to say we're not voting for it if it's a net tax increase, and that was enough to force tax reform to be tax reform. Revenue neutral, lower rates, broaden the base, got rid of the special interest tax credits and deductions. Without the pledge, you don't get tax reform, you just get tax increases. The pledge is why we got the sequester, because the president couldn't talk people into a $1.4 trillion tax increase, which is what he was asking for from that super committee. I talked to Kerry about it. He said, Grover, you got to help me. Here's what we need. What do you need? $1.4 trillion in higher taxes to pay for a $1.2 trillion deficit, because Obama wanted another $400 billion in spending, another stimulus, and there was $200 billion in spending that we all agreed could be cut. I was so taken aback by the $1.4 trillion tax increase that I forgot to ask about, what's the $200 billion we all agree on? I'd love to focus on that. When do we get to talk about the $200 billion in spending cuts that we all agree on? Because we had ivory soap percentages of the modern Republican Party getting elected by promising to their constituents that they would not raise no net tax increase. Okay, and promise me, President Harry Reid sometimes misstate that, I'm sure by mistake. The pledge, if you read it online, atr.org, is to the voters of your state and to the American people that I will oppose all efforts to raise taxes. Only if you convince the American people that the tax reform you're talking about is not a Trojan horse for a tax increase can you ever get a consensus to do tax reform. So I would argue that it's the opposite of what premise that somebody tried to put into the question. Tax reform happens only when taxpayers are convinced that it's not a hidden tax increase.
I have two more questions for each of you, if we could keep the answers brief, and I thank you both for doing that. And then I'll have one last question for both of you. Mr. Norquist, do you think the Republicans should shut down the government again if President Obama won't accede to their policy demands?
No, I don't think they should take the approach that was taken last year. I think it would have been better to have passed shorter bills. The idea of shutting down the government and thinking that the press will focus on the issue you want them to focus on instead of the shutdown is historically inaccurate and not a good idea. And besides, we're taking the Senate in a couple of months, so hold your horses.
And Mr. Nader, if you could briefly say, what is your most serious disagreement with Mr. Norquist?
Excuse me. Regulation. Health and safety standards are absolutely essential because people can't discern through their senses the degree of pollution in the air, water, food, emissions from nuclear plants, all the things that are invisible forms of violence. And I even got Milton Friedman, when I was debating him once in Pittsburgh, to agree. He was against all regulation, including licensing of doctors. And I said, well, you mean a barber can put a sign up and say, cardiovascular surgery, special price? He said, sooner or later, people will find out. Well, so sooner or later. But he did agree that pollution had to be regulated because there's no sensory, there's nothing that people can detect. Carbon monoxide, you can't smell it, taste it. And that's an area I think I can persuade a lot of people, including Grover, because last I heard, he breathes. He smells, he eats, he drinks. And the more we get together on the things we already agree on in principle, the easier it will be to enlighten each other. And I think they will enlighten us on some of the real wasteful programs that we have been very fearful of challenging for fear that they'll all go down the drain 100%. But it undermines the support for these programs. More of this will come if you subscribe to my column free, nader.org. I do follow crony capitalism and all these convergences. And I simply want to say, Grover, I'll pay for one full-time person if you pay for one full-time person, and we'll start right on the spot in a few weeks, the first totally committed convergent advocacy group in America.
We are almost out of time, but before asking the last question, we have a couple of housekeeping matters to take care of. First of all, I'd like to remind you of our upcoming events and speakers. On September 15th, Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker. September 17th, John G. Stumpf, CEO of Wells Fargo. September 19th, Larry Merlo, President and CEO of CVS Corporation. And Mr. Norquist and Mr. Nader, you're welcome to come back and join the audience and ask and submit questions. Now I'd like to present our guests with the traditional National Press Club mug. So, on my right, Mr. Nader, I hope you got one 10 years ago and you could add this to the collection. And Mr. Norquist, here is your first one, I believe, and I'm sure you'll be back for another one. We have a minute left. Can you each take 30 seconds to answer the following? I know we are a democratic republic, but if you were Emperor of America for one day, what would you do? Mr. Norquist, you first for 30. Wait, this is me.
Shoot the emperor. No emperors, never.
And Mr. Nader.
Abdicate.
Can I answer second? I like his answer better.
Mr. Norquist defers to Mr. Nader's answer. Let the record show that. Thank you again for coming today. thank you especially to our very special guest of honor. We are adjourned.